Hello internet users and welcome back to another video. Today, I'm once again continuing my journey to review every single Mega Man game. And for this video, I'm going to be covering one of the series' lesser known releases that was made for the Sega Genesis. Back in 1994, Capcom wanted to finally put out their first Mega Man game on a non-Nintendo platform. In order to reach out to a new audience, they had the idea to create Mega Man The Wily Wars, a Mega Man collection that completely remakes the first three NES games, with the inclusion of some original content too. However, nobody at Capcom would actually be making this title. Instead, development of Wily Wars was outsourced to a company called Minakuchi Engineering. Many of you may not recognize the name, but they were previously responsible for making most of the Mega Man games on Game Boy, and in the future would go on to handle the development of Mega Man X3. After learning about Wily Wars for the first time, I was actually pretty surprised that I'd never heard of it before. You would think that a collection that contains some of the most popular Mega Man games ever would be more well known, but it seems like it's something that a lot of people missed out on when it was new. Something that likely contributed to that is that the game's physical release in North America was outright cancelled. While Europe eventually got cartridges in 1995, the North American release was only briefly available through something called the Sega Channel, which was Sega's very short-lived online service for the Genesis that allowed people to download games. Outside of that, Wily Wars didn't really get an official re-release for several years. Recently though, it's finally started to see a lot more attention, now that it's appeared on things like the Genesis Mini and the Nintendo Switch online service. Having gone over the original three Mega Man games, I've been getting really curious about Wily Wars myself, and I've been wanting to see just how much these remakes and the new content has to offer. So let's get into it and revisit Mega Man's first three adventures. To start off, let me explain the story of this collection. In the instruction booklet, Dr. Wily has the genius idea of going back in time to destroy Mega Man in the past so that his plans can't be stopped in the future. So with his new time machine, he goes back to his first three encounters with Mega Man for a do-over. They really didn't need to have an excuse like this, but it's hilarious to know that this is all apparently canon to the Mega Man universe. Aside from that one piece of info in the instructions though, the story of all three games is still exactly the same. Mega Man and Dr. Light are even still surprised that Dr. Wily betrays them in Mega Man 3, so I can only guess that they're unaware that he's time traveling. With that weird explanation out of the way, let's get to talking about what's actually new with the trilogy now. The first and most obvious difference is the graphics. As I'm sure you can all see from the footage, the games have received a whole new look. While keeping the exact same level layout across the three games, everything 8-bit has become 16-bit. Mega Man 1 in particular looks the most different. Although I still think the first game looked pretty good for the time of its release, compared to Mega Man 2 and 3, some of the assets can look a bit samey, and many of the backgrounds are just a single flat color. In Wily Wars though, I think they really overhauled some of these stages. All of them have proper backgrounds now, and some aspects of them have been reimagined in what I think is a pretty cool way. Take Cutman Stage for example. In the original, it's really hard to say what this area is even supposed to be. There's blocks, ladders, and a few pieces of machinery here and there, but in this remake, they turned it into some kind of fortress in the sky. That may not sound very suited to a robot that was designed for cutting wood, but I think this new design fits pretty well with the stage's original layout, since you spend a good portion of it climbing up and down. Another noticeable change is to the boss select screen. The boss portraits have been updated to make this screen look closer to the one seen in every sequel released after it. I really do like seeing the original 6 get this kind of treatment. The Mega Man boss portraits have become pretty iconic, and the screen in the first game always felt like the odd one out in the series. They also gave Mega Man 1 a new title screen, or more accurately, they recreated the original Japanese title screen, and instead of it being completely silent, it now uses the music from Mega Man 3's title screen. For the graphics in Mega Man 2, you might recall that there were some giant boss fights that just had a single black background. This was likely to prevent the game from lagging since the NES probably couldn't handle it otherwise. These areas have new original backgrounds now. It's kind of refreshing to see, but at the same time, it feels kind of weird since I'm just so used to the black screens in the original. Mega Man 3 was already the most visually impressive of the trilogy. It had more variety with backgrounds and details than the other two games. The Wily Wars version is a clean-looking upgrade, turning everything into 16-bit, almost exactly how you'd imagine it. But anyhow, I don't think I need to sit here and show you a side-by-side comparison of every screen within the three games. As this video goes on, you'll get a good look at everything. Personally, I like the new graphics a lot. Although the look of NES Mega Man will always be pretty iconic, replaying the games this way was a nice change of pace for me. One thing that I absolutely will nitpick though is Proto Man's sprite in Mega Man 3. Even though Mega Man and every single Robot Master has new sprites, for Proto Man, they clearly just copy and pasted his from the NES and recolored them. It makes him look so tiny compared to Mega Man, and it's really noticeable how out of place he looks. Just look at him. Maybe they ran out of time at the end or something. I can't think of any other reason why a prevalent character like him just didn't get as much effort as everyone else. Moving along though, let's get to talking about what's different with the gameplay this time around. You might initially assume that this collection is nothing more than a graphical update, but trust me when I say that there are a ton of subtle changes across the three games. I should first mention though that everything I'm about to say is based off of me playing the version available on the Switch's online service. This is because it's currently the best and most accessible way for me to play this game right now. But another reason I need to clarify is because there apparently have been official releases in the past that are known to have issues with both slowdown and even the game not saving properly. To start off with the gameplay changes, I want to go over something important that applies to all games in the trilogy. It's a little unfortunate, but the firing speed of the Buster is a bit slower compared to the NES versions. If you're the type of person that's only gone through the original games once or twice, then you might not even feel a difference here. But when I jumped into this game, I could definitely tell something was off, and then I booted up the originals to confirm. Personally, I didn't find this to be a huge issue, and I was able to get used to it pretty quickly, but it is something that needs to be mentioned. I've heard people say that the slower Buster makes these versions unplayable, but I feel like that's a huge exaggeration. Another thing that I hear people dislike about this collection is Mega Man's new sprite size. As I said before, the sprites are new and a little bit larger. Most of the time though, I didn't think this really mattered, but there are a few screens in the game where they really should have adjusted things because of this. The most notable one, in my opinion, is during the first Wily stage in the first Mega Man. In the original, you needed to use the magnet beam to create platforms, so you can climb up and reach the ladder on the upper left side of the screen. However, in this version, you barely have any space to do this at the start. Once you're on a platform, you pretty much have to tap the D-pad just slightly to turn around, otherwise you fall off. This is made even worse by the fact that the devs made the energy in the previous room no longer infinite. They updated this mechanic to work like it does in the sequels, where placed energy refills only respawn once you game over. So if you mess up in the next room and run out, you just have to leap into the spikes over and over until you can restart the level completely. If we're talking about Mega Man 1 specifically, this one part here was absolutely made worse than the original game. And it's really weird to say that, because on the other hand, Wily Wars did actually fix something that was very broken before. These robots were always meant to be jumped on, so that you can cross the spikes below, but due to a huge oversight in the original, it was possible to just fall through them when you were about to land. And that right there is going to be a pattern you'll notice with this collection. For every change that fixes something, there's always something else that it manages to mess up instead. Which is also very strange because for the most part, Wily Wars really goes out of its way to try and preserve the original experience as much as possible. For example, Mega Man 2 and 3 have the exact same E-Tank limitations as before, with the second game still limiting you to 4, and the third game limiting you to 9. All three remakes even have perfect recreations of their weapon menus, which is a very nice touch. They could have gotten away with just giving the same menu to all of them, but it's nice that they went the extra mile there. In fact, for Mega Man 1 only, they even kept the game's score system and point items. I've ranted about this before, but scores in this game literally do nothing. No extra lives or any kind of bonus can be earned through points, and the lack of any stage time limit means you can just sit there and farm them until the points max out. It's a feature with no purpose and was just included in the original because at the time, arcade games with score systems were still incredibly popular. The Wily Wars devs could have easily just omitted this feature completely and no one would have cared. But the fact that they went out of their way just to recreate it only for the Mega Man 1 stages is something I really have to admire, even if it still doesn't do anything. But with that level of dedication to preserving the original experience, it might surprise you to hear about the random things they decided to change anyway. For example, for whatever reason, Cutman is no longer weak to the Buster. He now only takes a single point of damage from it. That might not sound like a big deal at first, since he still has his major weakness to the Gutsman blocks, but it becomes a problem later on during the Wily stages. During the rematch fight, there are no blocks to throw at him. The best way to beat him here now is to use the Firestorm, otherwise he'll take forever to go down from the Buster. And speaking of the other Robot Masters, some of them now also require entirely different strategies. In the original Fireman fight, you could just stand in place jumping over his shots as you blast away at him, but now, the fire left behind by his attacks will stay longer than a split second, so many old tactics don't work against him anymore. In the case of Elecman, you can no longer interrupt the startup of his attack, which makes the fight very obnoxious. It's a good thing his weakness still beats him very fast, so you can just get this over with pretty quickly. Other than those three, most of the other Robot Masters in Mega Man 1 don't have any major notable changes, aside from a few subtle differences with their AI. Like for example, I noticed that Bomb Man no longer always reacts the same way when you approach him. There's a little bit of randomness thrown into where he jumps now. In general, many of the Robot Masters and bosses across all three games have several changes to their fights. Some of these are very minor and almost unnoticeable, while others pretty much require you to develop an entirely new strategy to beat them. You'll definitely see what I mean by that as this video goes on. On that note, what better place to start than with the good old Yellow Devil fight in Mega Man 1. As you might have expected, the pause glitch from the original version no longer works here, so that will already make this quite a different experience for some people. If you're unfamiliar with this trick, let me quickly describe it for you. You know how when you hit some enemies, they'll have invincibility frames for a few seconds before they can be attacked again? Well, in Mega Man 1, pausing the game didn't actually pause the timer on invincibility frames. So when you hit an enemy, you could just pause, wait a few seconds, and unpause to hit them again before they even have a chance to react to the first hit. If you loop this with proper timing, you can defeat hard bosses like the Yellow Devil before they can even start their attack pattern again. It should be noted that when I say pause, I'm referring to the actual pause button, and not just opening the weapon menu. This version of Mega Man 1 obviously keeps the weapon menu, but removes the other pause function entirely, like all the sequels did. Some of you might be upset to hear about this trick getting removed, since I know some people can't stand to sit through this boss without it. I'm happy to tell you though, that in Wily Wars, they accidentally created an entirely different mistake that makes this fight much easier. For whatever reason, the devs forgot to put a wall on the left side of the arena. After you jump over the Yellow Devil's first set of attacks, you can just stand over here and never have to worry about dodging that attack ever again. It is absolutely hilarious to me that they missed this. It's so easy to do, and it isn't even a glitch this time. In contrast to that though, the boss in the following stage has been made more difficult. The Copy Robot is one of my least favorite bosses in the series so far. It's designed to react to your button presses while also still moving around randomly to a certain extent. It's not a very fun fight, as the only real strategy was to manipulate him into jumping into your shots, while hoping he moves away from you when the randomness comes into play. In Wily Wars, it feels like they made it even more random. Sometimes it'll even just start walking through the air for a split second, which I'm reasonably sure is not supposed to happen. The remaining bosses after that aren't too bad. The sewer machines technically require less shots from the Buster now, but the main difference in this battle is the change to the super arm. Blocks are now thrown in an arc instead of right in front of you. A very random change to make, but it obviously means that you have to aim your throws a little differently. As for the final battle against Dr. Wily, it's more or less exactly the same, with no changes to his weaknesses. My only complaint is about the weapon energy placed outside before you enter the arena. In the original, the devs clearly intended for you to always be able to pick this up between lives, so that you always had a reasonable fighting chance with your weapons instead of being forced to only use the Buster. The devs of this collection, though, clearly missed the point of that. Like I mentioned earlier, after you pick up a refill once, it doesn't appear again, unless you game over and restart the stage completely. So when you're going through the Robot Master Gauntlet before this, you better make extra sure you still have enough energy to hit Wily with his weakness. Next up, we're gonna go over more of the changes in Mega Man 2. The first thing to mention is that this version does not have 2 difficulties like some of you might be used to seeing. This is because the original Japanese release of Mega Man 2 did not have multiple difficulties. The easier normal mode was something only added in the NES versions released outside of Japan. So if you're playing the Wily Wars remake, expect this to be similar to what most know as the difficult mode on NES. That aside though, I think one of the most notable differences here is with the E-Tank mechanic. That's right, once again, after trying to keep a mechanic exactly the same as it was before, they still made a massive change to it anyway. Like in the original game, you can only carry 4 at a time, but this time it no longer takes them all away when you get a game over. This makes it much easier to save multiple tanks for the end of the game. Because of how the later bosses can be in Mega Man 2, I would definitely say that this is a welcome change. However, it's also very, very exploitable at the start. Metal Man Stage has a free E-Tank just sitting there right at the beginning. You can easily start a playthrough, pick this up, and then intentionally run out of lives repeatedly so you can keep getting more of them. With this strategy, you can breeze through the first chunk of the game without having to worry about your health much at all. However, one boss in particular stood out to me as being much more difficult, and that was Woodman. Because Mega Man and the bosses all have new sprite sizes, as a side effect, Woodman's surrounding leaf shield is now taller than it was before. This means that the jump to avoid it is much more strict with the timing. It might not look like it from the footage, but this fight becomes much more difficult as a result. I should also mention that this new hitbox applies to the Woodman Doc Robot fight in Mega Man 3 as well. Moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is an oversight that's actually pretty funny. Remember how I said that Mega Man 1 fixed the infamous pause glitch? Well, as it turns out, the original Mega Man 1 also had a second pause glitch that was fixed in the original Mega Man 2 and 3. In Wily Wars though, this second pause glitch is present in all 3 of the remade games. In the original Mega Man 1, you were allowed to open up the weapon menu during your hit stun animation. Doing so actually cancels Mega Man's knockback and allows him to keep walking forward. You obviously still take the damage from the attack, but this easily allows you to exploit the invincibility frames to walk through the enemy that hit you. This could be especially useful while jumping, as canceling knockback could prevent you from landing into a death pit or something. In Mega Man 2 and onward, the devs clearly realized how exploitable this could be, so they changed it so that the weapon menu could not be opened during the knockback animation. But as I said, here in Wily Wars, this exploit from Mega Man 1 now applies to all 3 games. So no matter which one you're playing, you can easily cancel your knockback with just a single button press. Ironically enough, this trick isn't actually too useful in Mega Man 1. In my opinion, there are a few places where you could use it to cheese past some annoying enemies, but typically, it's already easy enough to deal with those through normal gameplay. However, in Mega Man 2 and 3, there are a lot more instances where you can abuse this trick. For example, at the start of Bubble Man Stage in Mega Man 2, there are these platforms with frog robots placed at the edge. But if you just jump into them and open up the weapon menu, you can quickly just go right through them. From this clip alone, it should become pretty apparent why they didn't want you to do this in the original games. Getting back on track with the topic of Mega Man 2, let's go over what else is new with the Wily stages at the end. First off, I need to talk about what is probably one of the most annoying changes in the whole collection. During Wily Stage 1, there's a screen where you need to use item 1 to reach the ladder in the top left corner of the screen. In the original, this part could be a little frustrating for new players, because if you messed up, you had to awkwardly go back to collect more energy to try again. However, here in Wily Wars, this screen has become much more annoying. Because of Mega Man's new sprite size, the timing for reaching the ladder is much more strict. Which is weird because he's taller, so you'd think that it would make it easier, but it just doesn't work like that apparently. Even when you do manage to grab it, it ends up looking like you just barely made it. At least now though, when you get to the end of the stage, the dragon boss is now technically a bit easier. You only have these tiny platforms to stand on, so it's easy to get knocked off, but as I just went over, you can just pause to cancel the knockback of any hit you take. As long as you have the HP, you can just stand in one spot and throw quick boomerangs until it dies. The only other major thing I want to bring up about the Wily stages is the battle against Wily Machine 2 near the end. In my video on the original game, I mentioned that the hitboxes on one of its attacks was pretty broken. Dodging this attack consistently was borderline impossible, and I pretty much would always try to save E-tanks throughout the fortress just for this one part. However, in this version, they did seem to adjust the hitboxes a little. It's still a very difficult fight, but at least this time, if you're skilled enough, you can dodge the attacks properly instead of getting hit by a deceptive hitbox. Moving on to the next game, it's now time to go over some of the changes for Mega Man 3. I've already covered a few of them along the way, but there are still quite a few of them to show off. First, let's talk about the change to Needleman's weapon, the Needle Cannon. In the original, it was a very worthless weapon that functioned so similar to the Buster that you'd almost never use it. Its only purpose was as an occasional weakness to a few bosses. However, here in Wily Wars, it manages to be a little bit better, as it now fires faster than the Buster. This isn't really a huge positive though, since this is only true because the Buster is slower in this collection. And speaking of things that were useless in the original, you'll be excited to hear what they've done with everyone's favorite ability, the Rush Marine. As if it wasn't already bad enough, for some reason they made it so that if you jump onto land with it, it will automatically stop working. This was a terrible idea, since the few screens you can actually use it on very clearly placed energy refills outside of the water, expecting you to jump out and grab them. So now if you do that, it becomes impossible to get back into Rush, since calling him into the water just sends him into a bottomless pit. Another thing that they messed up was Magnet Man's weapon during a few boss fights. During the battles against Hardman and Doc Robot Metal Man, the missiles now treat the boss's projectiles as targets. This means that when you attempt to hit these two with their weakness, the missiles will just fly up and down off screen because they're trying to target the boss's attacks instead of the bosses themselves. This obviously changes how the fights need to be played if you still want to use their weakness against them. On the subject of Hardman, it's worth mentioning that his weapon received a downgrade as well. It was already too slow to be worth using before, but in Wily Wars, they decided that it now takes a split second longer before the attack is even capable of dealing damage. This is really noticeable when you're fighting Doc Robot Crashman. As before, it was really easy to get him to jump into the attack before it starts moving, but now, with this strategy, he will always have enough time to move out of the way, making this pretty much worthless here. Despite these weird quirks though, I've surprisingly found that this version of Mega Man 3 was a lot more fun for me to play than the original. This one doesn't have all the slowdown that I'd gotten used to with the NES version. That alone made this much more enjoyable. While the entire trilogy has its fair share of areas that cause the game to lag, the original Mega Man 3 was by far the worst for this. This is because Capcom infamously rushed the game out when the devs didn't think it was ready. On that note, another positive of the Wily Wars version is that it fixes a boss that was pretty much left unfinished before. The Mega Man holograms are now actually randomized and properly have invincibility frames between hits. This means you can no longer just go up to the top one and end the fight in half a second. And with that, when it comes to the differences between the original trilogy and the Wily Wars remakes, that's about everything I wanted to talk about. The first three Mega Man games are very iconic for a lot of reasons, and regardless of their flaws, the majority of people will always stick with the original versions. However, I don't think that should mean that everyone should just simply forget about these remakes. After spending a lot of time with them, I don't really view them as a better or worse way to experience the trilogy. Over the course of this video, I've listed so many random and small changes which on their own can look pretty meaningless. But when you go through the games and see all of these little gameplay changes piling up together, it starts to feel more like you're playing some kind of a range mode instead of a remake. For every little change that fixes something, there's another random change that arguably makes something worse. It might be a bit underwhelming to come to this conclusion, but at the end of the day, Wily Wars really is just another way of playing these three games again. If anything, it's fun to play through this just to see the reimagined visuals. But to move on, we're actually not quite done with Wily Wars just yet. There is still one major thing that this collection has to offer: the Wily Tower mode. When your save has beaten all three Mega Man games, the option for Wily Tower will appear in the menu. When it's selected, you'll be greeted with a new cutscene with Dr. Wily introducing 3 new robots he's created to finally defeat Mega Man. These 3 robots are Buster Rod G, Mega Water S, and Hyperstorm H. Wily Tower is a mode that is often overlooked in an already overlooked collection. It's essentially its own mini Mega Man game, with its own set of Robot Masters and Wily stages. The main feature of this game is that it allows you to use every weapon and ability from the first 3 Mega Man games. Whenever you enter a stage, you're taken to a new menu where you can build your own custom set of weapons to take with you. You're given 8 weapon slots and 3 ability slots, which can be filled with any combination of the Magnet Beam, items 1, 2, and 3, or any of the Rush forms. It should also be noted that the 3 main bosses here do not give you any new weapons when defeated. The game is entirely designed around existing abilities and doesn't include any new ones. As I'm sure you can imagine, this really affects how the stages and bosses are designed. Since you can pick from 20 different attacks and can't carry them all at once, enemies and bosses have to have multiple weaknesses instead of just 1 or 2. You can really just pick whatever you feel like, and you're likely to have something on you that can make a room or boss much easier. So many sections here are clearly designed to be tackled in different ways and encourage you to experiment. Despite that though, Wily Tower still suffers from the obvious problem that some of the weapons are much better than the others. For example, remember how overpowered the Thunder Beam was in Mega Man 1? Remember how good the Metal Blades were in Mega Man 2? Well, now you can take both of them at the same time, and pretty much deal with anything that gets in your way. Some weapons are just straight up weaker versions of others, which really affects your selection. For example, the Spark Shock in Mega Man 3 has the exact same function as the Ice Slasher from Mega Man 1, where they freeze enemies in place. However, the Spark Shock has the extra restriction where you can't pause and switch weapons again until after the effect wears off. The Ice Slasher does not have this restriction. Therefore, there is literally no reason to ever pick the Spark Shock. You could make the argument that some of these could still function as a boss weakness, but as I said earlier, bosses here were given several weaknesses. Even if a boss was weak to something like the Spark Shock, odds are you probably have something else on you that'll do as much damage anyway. One attack that they made completely worthless though was the Super Arm from Mega Man 1. I am not even joking, in the entire playthrough, there is just one block during one stage, and all that's behind it is an extra life. Don't even bother selecting this. It is, however, kind of worth it to take the Crash Bomb and Hard Knuckle with you. Throughout this game, there are a handful of walls you might recognize from Mega Man 2 and 3. If you destroy these with the bomb or knuckle, there is often a free E-Tank, so it's not a bad idea to take these along if you can't decide what else to choose for a stage. As for the ability slots, they also kind of suffer from similar problems, even though you can only have 3 of them at a time. There is no point in choosing items 1, 2, or 3 when the Rush Jet just lets you do everything they can do, but much better. Funnily enough, Wily Tower actually includes a bunch of water rooms in an attempt to make the Rush Marine do something, but it's still not even worth using here either. Moving on, let's talk about the 3 main bosses and their stages. These 3 robots are known in Japan as the Mega World Core, but in other regions were renamed to the Genesis Unit. This is an obvious nod to the fact that the Sega Mega Drive console was renamed to the Sega Genesis in North America. However, nothing about the group's name is actually stated anywhere in the game itself. Unlike the usual Robot Master stages, the Genesis Unit stages don't exactly have any distinct visual themes of their own. From the footage I've been showing, you've all probably noticed that Wily Tower reuses a lot of assets from the other 3 games, with a little bit of new stuff here and there. And since you already have the tools to breeze through most obstacles anyway, you won't really remember much about these stages. The boss fights are definitely the most original and memorable thing about this game. As I said, the Genesis Unit are pretty much the Robot Masters of this game, but Hyperstorm H manages to be a little bit different by having spikes on the wall and 2 entire health bars during his fight. The Wily stages have brand new bosses as well, and they serve their purpose just fine. I wouldn't call them anything amazing, but it's nice that they're all original and not recycled. However, I have to say that Wily Tower is a pretty short game. It only took me about 40 minutes to complete it. Obviously, since there are only 3 Robot Master stages before a handful of Wily stages, it's not surprising that it can be finished so quickly. However, the main reason you can run through it so fast is because you start with 3 games worth of abilities. If you have even the slightest grasp on how to use some of these abilities, you can steamroll every obstacle without much thought. For example, in one of the Wily stages, Buster Rod G returns for a rematch. In his arena, the platforms are falling and you have to chase him as he climbs, while avoiding the bottom of the screen. But on my literal second attempt, I figured out that I could just run up to him and blast away with the air shooter, and win before the fight even begins. This is the kind of cheese you learn about after a few playthroughs or something, but I was regularly able to do stuff like this because it's just so easy to find a weakness. But with how the game currently is, I think the best way to appreciate the boss patterns, at least when replaying it, is to challenge yourself with something like a Buster-only run. When I did this for Buster Rod G's first fight, I had a lot more fun figuring this one out. You can still see that the patterns are crafted in a way where you can still have a challenging but fair experience when using the bare minimum. Don't get me wrong though, it is still satisfying to use multiple weapons to blast your way through one final encounter with Wily, but this game is pretty short and easy to complete that way. But anyhow, once you reach the end and defeat the last boss, you're treated with a cutscene of Mega Man chasing Wily through a field, while the game goes through a list of robot masters. And with that, we finally reach the end of Wily Wars. For me personally, I found that this collection was a lot of fun to play through. The 3 remakes have their weird decisions, sure, but seeing everything in 16-bit made it a fun way to experience them again. Wily Tower is a nice little bonus that I can definitely see myself coming back to. Although, if you're not a fan of the remakes, you might find it a bit tedious to unlock, especially because of how short it is. Also, just a heads up, when you save your game again after beating Wily Tower, the file will no longer let you access the completed Genesis unit stages. So if you're playing this on something like Switch Online, I'd make a save state when it's first unlocked. Otherwise, you won't be able to replay it from the beginning. And with all of that taken care of, I think it's time I finally move on to another Mega Man game. My name is Pikasprey, and thanks for watching.